The autumn wind carved through Cedar Falls like a blade, carrying whispers of winter down from the Colorado peaks. In the valley below, oil lamps flickered behind frost-kissed windows, each one a small defiance against the gathering darkness. But high on the mountain ridge, where the stars burned bright and cold, a figure knelt in the shadows between the pines. His voice, rough from years of solitude, rose into the thin air like smoke from a dying fire. "Lord, keep her safe tonight. Keep them both safe. I know I ain't got the right to ask, but she's good, pure as fresh snow. Don't let my darkness touch her light." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Grace Harper had no idea that someone was praying for her. She stood at her classroom window, watching the last student disappear down the dusty main street, her breath fogging the glass. Behind her, 12-year-old Tommy Harper swept chalk. Dust from between the floorboards, his thin shoulders bent with the weight of responsibilities no child should carry. The schoolhouse felt colder each evening, as if the walls themselves knew winter was coming, and with it, decisions that would change everything. The letter had arrived that morning, delivered by a boy who wouldn't meet her eyes. Official seal. Heavy paper, words that cut deeper than any mountain wind. Judge William Garrett requested Emma's presence at his chambers within the fortnight to discuss Tommy's continued welfare and proper placement. The language was polite, civilized, but Emma knew what it meant. She had seen it happen to other families. Orphaned children declared unfit for their current circumstances and sent away to work farms or worse. The judge had a reputation for such benevolence, always acting in the children's best interests, always finding loving homes for the unfortunate. The gold that changed hands afterward was simply a donation to his generous heart. Emma folded the letter carefully, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her chest. She had fought for 2 years to keep Tommy with her, ever since the cave-in at the copper mine took their parents. She had convinced the territorial authorities that a schoolteacher was perfectly capable of raising her younger brother. She had stretched every penny, grown vegetables in the rocky soil behind their cabin, mended and remended their clothes until the patches had patches. But now Judge Garrett had arrived in Cedar Falls, and children had a way of disappearing when he took interest in their welfare. Tommy looked up from his sweeping, his dark eyes too old for his 12 years. He had their father's stubborn chin and their mother's gentle heart, but lately, Emma saw shadows there that reminded her of herself. Worry aged children faster than time. "Emma, Mrs. Caldwell says there's been riders coming through town," he said quietly. "Says they're asking questions about families, about kids without proper guardians." Emma's jaw tightened. Ruth Caldwell ran the boarding house and heard everything that passed through Cedar Falls. If she was warning Emma, it meant the situation was worse than a simple letter from a judge. "Don't you worry about that," Emma said, though her voice sounded hollow in the empty classroom. "We're doing just fine." Tommy set down the broom and looked at her with those two knowing eyes. "Are we?" The question hung between them like a held breath. Emma wanted to lie, to give him the comfort children deserved. But Tommy had stopped being a child the day their parents died. He knew the price of flour had doubled. He knew their father's pocket watch was the only thing of value they had left. He knew Emma gave him the larger portion at every meal. "We'll figure something out," she said finally. "We always do." But as they walked home through the gathering dusk, Emma wondered if this time might be different. The cabin felt smaller each night, the walls closing in like a trap. She lit the oil lamp and set it in the window, a habit from their mother, who always said light called wanderers home. Tonight, it felt more like a beacon of desperation than welcome. Tommy went to bed without his usual protests, exhaustion winning over his desire to help with the endless chores. Emma sat at the scarred wooden table, staring at papers that refused to balance no matter how many times she rearranged the numbers. $13.47. That was all that stood between them and whatever fate Judge Garrett had planned. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending shadows dancing across the walls. Emma pulled her shawl tighter and tried to focus on the lesson plans for tomorrow's classes. Education was the future, she told herself. Knowledge was power. But power required time, and time was the one thing she didn't have. A sound made her look up. Hoofbeats, distant but approaching. Emma's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle above the mantel, then stopped. If Judge Garrett's men were coming, a gun would only make things worse. She blew out the lamp and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. The rider was alone, a dark figure on a darker horse. He paused at the edge of their property, visible only as a silhouette against the star-filled sky. For a long moment, he simply sat there, as if debating whether to approach. Then, to Emma's surprise, he turned his horse away and disappeared back into the night. Emma remained at the window long after the hoofbeats faded. Something about the rider troubled her, though she couldn't say what. There had been something deliberate in his pause, something that suggested he knew exactly who lived in this cabin. In a town like Cedar Falls, strangers were noticed, remembered, discussed over coffee and cards. But this rider moved like smoke, there and gone without disturbing the air. She relit the lamp and returned to her papers, but concentration proved impossible. The numbers swam before her eyes, meaningless figures that represented the impossible. Mathematics of survival. $13.47 against the machinery of territorial law and political corruption. David facing Goliath, but without the advantage of divine favor. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of courtrooms and black-robed figures reaching for Tommy with grasping hands. Emma woke before dawn, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The cabin was silent, except for Tommy's steady breathing from his small bed near the stove. She dressed quietly and stepped outside to fetch water from the well. The morning air bit at her cheeks, sharp and clean. Frost covered the pumpkins in their garden, turning them into glass sculptures that would melt with the first touch of sun. Emma worked the pump handle, the screech of metal on metal, cutting through the pre-dawn stillness. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache, but she drank deeply anyway, trying to wash away the taste of fear. As she turned to go back inside, something caught her eye. There, beside the well, was a small pile of split firewood that hadn't been there the night before. The pieces were cut to the exact length needed for their stove, stacked with the care of someone who understood the value of properly seasoned pine. Emma looked around the yard, searching for any sign of who might have left such a gift. The only tracks in the frost were her own. She touched one of the logs hesitantly, as if it might disappear like something from a dream. The wood was real. Solid, dry enough to burn clean. Enough to last them through several cold nights. Emma had learned not to question unexpected kindness too closely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In a place like Cedar Falls, charity often came without signature, offered by neighbors who understood that pride could be as dangerous as cold. But as she carried the wood inside, piece by careful piece, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this gift had nothing to do with neighborly charity. There had been something too precise about the stack, too knowing about the size and amount. Someone had been watching their cabin closely enough to know exactly what they needed. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, for reasons she couldn't name, it brought a strange kind of comfort. In a world that seemed determined to take everything from her, someone, somewhere was paying attention. Someone cared enough to cut wood in the darkness and leave it without expectation of thanks. Tommy woke to the smell of coffee and flapjacks, luxuries Emma rarely allowed herself. But today felt different, charged with a strange energy that demanded small celebrations. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, dark hair sticking up in impossible directions. "Smells like Sunday," he said, grinning. "Maybe it is Sunday," Emma replied, though they both knew it was Thursday. "Maybe every day can be Sunday if we decide it is." Tommy's grin widened. This was the Emma he remembered from before, the sister who made games out of hardship and found magic in ordinary moments. She had been disappearing lately, replaced by a worried stranger who counted pennies and stared at legal papers with frightened eyes. But this morning she was back. They ate breakfast by the window, watching the sun paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose. The town below was waking up, smoke rising from chimneys, early risers heading toward the mines or the shops on Main Street. Cedar Falls looked peaceful from their cabin, like a picture from one of Tommy's storybooks. It was easy to forget, in moments like this, that peace was often an illusion. "Emma," Tommy said quietly, setting down his fork, "are we really going to be okay?" The question was simple, but Emma heard all the layers beneath it. The fear, the trust, the desperate hope that the adult in his life actually had answers. She wanted to give him certainty, to promise that love and determination were enough to overcome any obstacle. But lies, even kind ones, had a way of turning bitter. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I know we're not giving up. And I know we're not facing this alone." Tommy nodded, satisfied with honesty over false comfort. "The firewood," he said. "Someone left us firewood. I saw that." "Who do you think it was?" Emma looked out at the mountains, where morning shadows still clung to the high places. "I don't know, but I'm grateful." Tommy followed her gaze, squinting against the bright sky. "Maybe it was an angel," he said seriously. "Mama always said angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they just have kind hearts." Emma smiled, the first real smile she had managed in days. "Maybe you're right." But even as she spoke, Emma's thoughts drifted to the mysterious rider from the night before. Angels, in her experience, didn't usually travel on horseback or move through the darkness like creatures avoiding the light. Whatever force was watching over them, it was more complicated than Tommy's innocent faith allowed. As they prepared for another day of school, Emma caught herself glancing toward the mountains. More often than usual. Somewhere up there, in the thin air and rocky places where only the determined ventured, someone was paying attention to a schoolteacher and her brother. Someone who cut wood in darkness and left gifts without acknowledgement. Someone who might be the answer to prayers Emma was afraid to voice, or the beginning of troubles she couldn't yet imagine. The school bell rang across the valley, calling children to learning and adults to another day of survival. Emma locked their cabin door and walked toward town with Tommy at her side, neither of them knowing that high above, a figure watched from the ridge. Daniel Sullivan lowered his field glasses and touched the worn Bible in his coat pocket. Another day began, another day of standing guard over the light that flickered in the valley below. The people of Cedar Falls called him Black Dan, the soulless outlaw who rode with death at his shoulder. They crossed themselves when his name was mentioned and warned their children about the monster in the mountains. They had no idea that every morning and every night he knelt among the pines and prayed for their safety. They couldn't imagine that a man with blood on his hands might also have love in his heart. But Emma Grace Harper was about to learn that. The most dangerous assumptions were often the ones we made about people we had never truly seen. And in a place like Cedar Falls, where winter was coming and justice wore a corrupt face, the difference between salvation and damnation might rest in the hands of an outlaw who talked to God in the language of the desperate and the lost. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street when Emma first laid eyes on Black Dan Sullivan. She was leading her students back from their nature walk along Cedar Creek, Tommy at her side collecting smooth stones for their arithmetic lessons. When the thunder of hoofbeats made everyone freeze. From the east end of town, where the mountain trail met the dusty road. A rider emerged like something conjured from the darkest tailies whispered around winter fires. The horse was magnificent and terrible, black as midnight with eyes that seemed to hold storms. But it was the man astride the beast that made Emma's breath catch in her throat. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat the saddle with the easy grace of someone born to violence. His coat was the color of charcoal, worn but well cared for, and beneath the wide brim of his hat, Emma caught a glimpse of features carved from granite and shadow. This was no ordinary drifter seeking work or shelter. This was predator-made flesh, danger given form. The children pressed closer to Emma, their young faces pale with instinctive fear. Tommy's hand found hers, his fingers cold despite the warm morning air. Around them, the town seemed to hold its breath. Shopkeepers appeared in doorways, their faces grim. Women gathered their skirts and hurried indoors, pulling their children with them. Men emerged from the Silver Dollar Saloon, hands resting on gun belts with practiced ease. Daniel Sullivan rode down Main Street like he owned it, his gaze moving from building to building with the careful assessment of a man who expected trouble and was prepared to meet it. He didn't hurry, didn't show any awareness of the fear radiating from every corner of Cedar Falls. To all appearances, he was simply a traveler passing through, but everyone knew better. Black Dan Sullivan's reputation had preceded him like the shadow of a storm cloud. Emma found herself studying him despite every instinct screaming at her to look away. There was something about his bearing that didn't match the stories. She had expected swaggering cruelty, the ostentatious display of a man drunk on his own power. Instead, she saw careful control, almost military precision. His movements were economical, purposeful. Even his horse seemed to sense the restraint, moving with quiet dignity rather than the wild prancing one might expect from an outlaw's mount. As he drew nearer to the schoolhouse, Daniel's head turned slightly, and for one heart-stopping moment his eyes met Emma's. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, everything else fading into irrelevance. His eyes were not the cold black of a killer's stare, but deep brown shot through with flecks of gold, like sunlight filtering through autumn leaves. There was intelligence there, and something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. The moment stretched between them, pregnant with unspoken questions. Emma felt as though he was seeing straight through her, reading the fears and hopes she kept hidden even from herself. Then Tommy shifted beside her, and the spell broke. Daniel's gaze moved on, sweeping over the cluster of children with what might have been concern rather than threat. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was almost courtly, then continued his measured progress down the street. Emma realized she had been holding her breath. Around her, the children remained frozen, waiting for some signal that the danger had passed. But danger, Emma was beginning to understand, was a more complicated thing than she had imagined. The man who had just ridden past them was certainly dangerous, but not in the way the story suggested. There had been no malice in his gaze, no hunger for violence. If anything, he had seemed almost protective. The thought was ridiculous, and Emma dismissed it immediately. This was Black Dan Sullivan, the scourge of the territory, the man who had robbed banks from Colorado to Kansas. The fact that he didn't look like a monster meant nothing. The most dangerous predators were often the ones who appeared most harmless. "Miss Emma," whispered Jenny Morrison, a gap-toothed 8-year-old with pigtails the color of corn silk. Was that really him? Was that the Black Dan? Emma forced her voice to remain steady. That was just a traveler, children. Nothing for us to worry about. But even as she spoke the words, Emma knew they weren't true. Daniel Sullivan was many things, but just a traveler wasn't one of them. Men like him didn't simply pass through towns like Cedar Falls without purpose. They came for reasons, and those reasons usually involved trouble for someone. As they reached the schoolhouse, Emma noticed Mrs. Caldwell hurrying toward them, her usually neat gray hair escaping from its pins. Ruth Caldwell was not a woman given to hysteria, but her face was flushed with excitement and worry. "Emma, dear," she called, slightly out of breath. "You need to know. That man, Sullivan, he's taken a room at my place." Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. "He's staying? Here? In town?" Ruth nodded, glancing around nervously as if the outlaw might materialize from thin air. "Paid for a week in advance, gold coin. Said he had business to conduct." She lowered her voice to a whisper. "Emma, whatever business that man has here, it can't be good. You need to be extra careful, especially with Tommy." The warning sent a chill down Emma's spine. If Daniel Sullivan planned to stay in Cedar Falls for a week, it meant whatever had brought him here was serious. Outlaws didn't take rooms at boarding houses for the pleasure of small-town life. They came for scores, for revenge, for reasons that usually left people dead or ruined. That evening, as Emma helped Tommy with his lessons by lamplight, she found her thoughts returning again and again to those brown eyes flecked with gold. There had been something familiar about them, though she was certain she had never seen the man before. Cedar Falls was too small for strangers to go unnoticed, and Black Dan Sullivan was not the sort of man anyone would forget meeting. The night passed restlessly. Emma dozed fitfully, waking at every sound from outside. The wind in the eaves became hoofbeats. The settling of the cabin walls became footsteps on the porch. More than once, she crept to the window and peered out into the darkness, half expecting to see a figure watching from the shadows. But the yard remained empty, lit only by starlight and the thin crescent of a waning moon. Morning brought fresh worries. As Emma prepared breakfast, Tommy burst through the door with news that made her blood run cold. "Emma, you have to see this," he said, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "There's something on our doorstep." Emma followed him outside, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, placed neatly beside their front door, was a burlap sack filled with supplies. Coffee, sugar, dried beans, salt pork, even a small bag of precious white flour. Enough food to last them 2 weeks, maybe more if they were careful. Emma stared at the sack as if it might sprout wings and fly away. The supplies were expensive, far beyond what any neighbor could afford to give. More troubling still was the implication. Someone knew exactly what they needed, down to the last detail. Someone had been watching them closely enough to understand their circumstances. Who would leave all this? Tommy asked, running his fingers over the rough burlap. Emma's mind raced through the possibilities. Ruth Caldwell was kind, but not wealthy enough for such generosity. The other families in town were struggling just as much as they were. That left only one explanation, impossible as it seemed. "I don't know," she said finally, though her thoughts kept returning to those brown eyes and the almost courtly touch of a hat brim. The day passed in a haze of distraction. Emma taught her lessons mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Every sound from the street made her look up, expecting to see that familiar dark figure on his magnificent horse. But Daniel Sullivan remained invisible, though his presence hung over the town like smoke from a distant fire. During the lunch break, Emma sent the children outside to play and walked to the window overlooking Main Street. The town looked normal. Enough, people going about their business with determined normalcy. But there was tension in the air, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. Cedar Falls was holding its breath, waiting for whatever storm Black Dan Sullivan had brought with him. As the afternoon wore on, stories began to filter in from the children whose parents worked in the shops and saloons. Daniel had been seen at the general store, purchasing supplies with gold coins that caught the light like captured sunshine. He had visited the Silver Dollar, where he sat alone at a corner table, nursing a single whiskey and listening to conversations without participating. Most disturbing of all, he had been asking questions. Quiet questions about families, about children, about people who might be vulnerable to outside influences. Emma's blood chilled when she heard that last detail. A man like Daniel Sullivan asking about vulnerable families could only mean one thing. He was scouting targets, identifying potential victims for whatever scheme had brought him to Cedar Falls. The thought that he might be working with Judge Garrett occurred to her, though it seemed unlikely. Corrupt officials usually kept their distance from notorious outlaws, preferring to maintain the fiction of respectability. That evening, Emma made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of hurrying home after school, she walked deliberately toward the Silver Dollar Saloon. She had never set foot in such an establishment, and the very thought made her mother's voice echo disapprovingly in her mind. But if Daniel Sullivan was targeting families in Cedar Falls, she needed to know. And if he was planning something that involved Tommy, she intended to find out what it was. The Silver Dollar was busier than usual, filled with men who had found excuses to linger after work rather than face their empty homes. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and nervous tension. Conversations that should have been loud and boisterous were conducted in whispers. Every few moments, eyes would dart toward the corner table where Daniel sat alone, as still and watchful as a cat studying a mouse hole. Emma pushed through the swinging doors with more confidence than she felt. The conversation stopped immediately, dozens of pairs of eyes turning toward her in surprise. A respectable schoolteacher in a saloon was almost as shocking as the presence of a notorious outlaw. "Miss Harper," called Jim Bradley, the proprietor, his voice tight with concern. "This ain't really the place for—" "I need to speak with someone," Emma said firmly, her gaze moving to the corner table. "I won't be long." Daniel looked up as she approached, and once again Emma felt that strange sense of recognition. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, premature aging that spoke of hard years and harder choices. There was a scar along his jawline, barely visible beneath several days' worth of dark stubble. His hands, wrapped around a glass of amber whiskey, were strong and calloused, the hands of a man who worked for his living. "Miss Harper," he said quietly, rising to his feet with old-fashioned courtesy. His voice was deeper than she had expected, roughened by wind and weather, but cultured underneath. "I was wondering when you'd come." The words sent a shock through Emma's system. "You were expecting me?" Daniel gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit. We have things to discuss." Emma remained standing, every instinct screaming at her to run. "I don't think we have anything to discuss, Mr. Sullivan." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Don't we? Someone's been leaving gifts on your doorstep. Someone's been watching over you and your brother. Don't you want to know why?" The admission hit Emma like a physical blow. "That was you." "Some of it," Daniel admitted, "though not all. You've got more friends in this town than you realize, Miss Harper. People who care about what happens to you and Tommy." Emma sank into the chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "Why?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if memorizing every detail. When he spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean forward to hear him. "Because 5 years ago, I watched corrupt men destroy my family. I watched them take everything that mattered and twist it into something ugly for their own profit." His brown eyes met hers, and Emma saw pain there that matched her own. "I swore I'd never let that happen again. Not if I could prevent it. What does that have to do with us?" "Judge Garrett isn't here by accident, Miss Harper. He's been sent. There are people who profit from taking children away from families who can't fight back. Good children from good families, sold to work gangs or worse." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Your brother is exactly the kind of child they target. Smart, strong, old enough to work but young enough to break." Emma felt the world tilt around her. "You're lying. Am I?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her face. "Tell me, Miss Harper, what happened to the Morrison children after their father died in the mine collapse? Or the Patterson girl after her mother got sick? Where did they go when Judge Garrett decided they needed proper placement? Emma's blood turned to ice. She knew exactly what had happened to those children. They had disappeared, supposedly sent to loving families in distant territories. But there had been no letters, no word of how they were faring. They had simply vanished, as if they had never existed at all. How do you know this? Because I make it my business to know, Daniel said simply. Because men like Garrett count on people not asking questions, not looking too closely at where the children really go. He finished his whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate care. And because I've been hunting the bastards who killed my family for 5 years. Judge Garrett is one of them. Emma stared at him, her mind reeling. Everything she thought she knew about the situation was crumbling around her. If Daniel was telling the truth, then the threat to Tommy was far worse than she had imagined. And the man sitting across from her, the notorious Black Dan Sullivan, might be the only thing standing between her family and destruction. Why should I believe you? Daniel reached into his coat, moving slowly to avoid startling her. He pulled out a folded paper and placed it on the table between them. Because that's a copy of the order authorizing your brother's transfer. It's already been signed. Judge Garrett is just going through the motions of a hearing to make it look legal. Emma's hands shook as she unfolded the paper. The official territorial seal seemed to mock her from the top of the page. There, in formal legal language, was Tommy's death sentence. Transfer authorization for Thomas William Harper, age 12. To the custody of the Territorial Child Welfare Bureau for placement in a suitable institutional environment. Signed, sealed, and dated 3 days from now. This can't be legal, she whispered. It is if no one challenges it, Daniel said. And who's going to challenge a territorial judge? You? A schoolteacher with $13 to her name and no political connections? Emma looked up at him, and for the first time since their conversation began, she saw something other than grim determination in his eyes. There was sympathy there, and something that might have been hope. What do you want from me? Nothing. Daniel said, I want to give you something, a choice. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I can stop this, Miss Harper. I can make sure Judge Garrett never touches your brother, but you have to trust me. Trust. The word hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Trust a notorious outlaw with her brother's life. Trust a man whose very name made grown men reach for their guns. Trust brown eyes flecked with gold and a voice that spoke of old pain and new determination. And what happens to you? Emma asked. What happens when the law comes looking for the man who interfered with a territorial judge? Daniel's smile was sharp as winter wind. Let me worry about the law, Miss Harper. I've been dancing with it for 5 years. I know the steps. Emma stared at the paper in her hands, at the official words that would tear her family apart. 3 days. That's all the time she had left before everything she had fought for disappeared into the machine of territorial bureaucracy. 3 days to find a miracle or watch Tommy vanish forever. She looked up at Daniel Sullivan, this dangerous man who claimed to be her salvation and made a choice that would change everything. What do you need me to do? For the first time since she had met him, Daniel's smile was genuine, transforming his harsh features into something almost gentle. Right now, nothing. Go home to your brother. Have dinner. Read him a story. Let him be a child for a little while. Longer. His expression grew serious again. But tomorrow night, when the moon is dark, be ready. Because that's when we're going to save his life. Emma folded the paper and stood on unsteady legs. The saloon around them had grown quiet, the other patrons straining to hear a conversation that could determine the fate of Cedar Falls itself. She felt their eyes on her as she walked toward the door, felt the weight of their curiosity and fear. At the threshold, she turned back. Daniel was watching her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Mr. Sullivan, she said quietly, that first night when you rode past our cabin, why didn't you stop? His answer followed her into the growing darkness. Because I wasn't ready to be the man you needed me to be, but I am now. Emma walked home through streets that seemed different than they had that morning. The familiar buildings looked strange in the gathering twilight, as if she was seeing them through new eyes. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her situation, her choices, had been stripped away and rebuilt in the space of a single conversation. At home, Tommy was waiting with questions she couldn't answer and fears she couldn't soothe. How do you tell a 12-year-old boy that powerful men want to steal his future? How do you explain that the monster from the stories might be the only thing standing between him and a fate worse than death? She didn't. Instead, she made his favorite dinner with the supplies that had appeared on their doorstep. She helped him with his arithmetic, praised his improving penmanship, and read him 3 chapters from a book about brave knights and distant kingdoms. For a few hours, she let him be the child Daniel had told her to let him be. But long after Tommy had fallen asleep, Emma sat by the window, staring out at the mountain ridges where somewhere a dangerous man was preparing to risk everything for people he barely knew. Tomorrow night, when the moon was dark, her life would change forever. She could only hope it would change for the better. In the distance, barely audible above the wind, she thought she heard the sound of a voice raised in prayer. The knock came at Emma's door just as the evening shadows began to stretch across her small cabin. She had been expecting it, dreading it, knowing that sooner or later Judge Garrett would want to meet the woman who stood between him and his prize. When she opened the door, she found herself face to face with a man whose reputation for benevolence was as carefully crafted as his appearance. Judge William Garrett was a study in understated authority. His suit was expensive, but not ostentatious, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his smile warm enough to melt the heart of any concerned citizen. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to having his wishes treated as commands. Behind him stood 2 men who might have been clerks or businessmen, if one ignored the telltale bulges beneath their coats and the way their eyes constantly scanned for threats. "Miss Harper," the judge said, removing his hat with a flourish. That belonged to an earlier, more gracious age. "I hope you'll forgive the unexpected visit. I was hoping we might have a private conversation about young Thomas." Emma's grip tightened on the doorframe, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Of course, Your Honor. Please come in." The cabin felt smaller with 4 adults crowding into its modest space. Tommy looked up from his books at the table, his young face immediately wary. Emma had tried to prepare him for this moment without terrifying him, but there was no preparing a child for the sight of powerful men discussing his future as if he were livestock to be appraised. "Thomas," Judge Garrett said warmly, moving toward the boy with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to charming children. "What a fine young man you've become. Your sister has done an admirable job raising you." Tommy's eyes flicked too. Emma, seeking guidance. She nodded slightly, and he stood, offering a polite but reserved greeting. "Thank you, sir." The judge's smile widened. "Such good manners. Tell me, son, do you enjoy your studies?" "Yes, sir." "Emma's a good teacher." "I'm sure she is. And I'm sure you've been a great help to her, especially during these difficult times." The judge's tone remained warm, but Emma caught the underlying calculation. He was assessing Tommy like a horse trader examining bloodlines. It must be hard, trying to be the man of the house at such a young age. Tommy straightened his shoulders. "I don't mind. Emma and I take care of each other." "Of course you do. That speaks well of both of you." Judge Garrett turned to Emma, his expression shifting to one of sympathetic concern. "Miss Harper, might we speak privately? I believe young Thomas would benefit from some fresh air while we discuss his future." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. "Tommy, why don't you go check on the chickens? Make sure they're settled for the night." Tommy hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her alone with these strangers. "I'll be fine," she assured him. Just stay close to the house." After Tommy left, Judge Garrett settled himself in the cabin's best chair with the air of a man making himself at home. His companions positioned themselves near the door and window, ostensibly casual but effectively blocking any easy escape. "Miss Harper," the judge began, his voice taking on the tone of a concerned father, "I want you to know how much I admire what you've attempted here. Trying to raise your brother alone, providing him with an education, maintaining a household. On a teacher's salary. It shows tremendous character." Emma remained standing, unwilling to make herself comfortable in the presence of a predator. "Thank you, Your Honor. However," the judge continued, "character alone isn't always sufficient to meet a child's needs. Thomas is entering a crucial stage of his development. He needs opportunities that a small town like Cedar Falls simply cannot provide. He needs the guidance of men who can prepare him for the responsibilities of adulthood." The words were delivered with such practiced sincerity that Emma almost found herself nodding along. This was how he did it, she realized. How he convinced grieving families to surrender their children. He made theft sound like charity, predation like protection. "Tommy is happy here," Emma said carefully. "He's doing well in school. He has friends. He knows he's loved." "Love is wonderful, Miss Harper, but it doesn't put food on the table or shoes on growing feet." The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more serious. "I've reviewed your financial situation. I know about the debts, the struggle to make ends meet. How long do you think you can continue this way? How long before the boy begins to suffer for your noble but impractical determination?" Emma felt the trap closing around her. Every word was reasonable, every concern legitimate. If she hadn't known what she knew, if Daniel hadn't shown her that damning document, she might have been grateful for such thoughtful intervention. "We manage," she said simply. Judge Garrett sighed, a sound heavy with regret. "Miss Harper, I'm going to be frank with you. I've received reports about your situation. Concerned citizens who worry about a child's welfare. There are questions about your ability to provide adequate supervision, proper nutrition, suitable living conditions." The accusations hit Emma like physical blows. She thought of the times Tommy had gone to bed hungry so she could have a full meal the next day. The nights they had huddled together for warmth because firewood was too expensive. The patches on his clothes that couldn't hide how fast he was outgrowing them. "However," the judge continued, "I'm not without compassion. I understand that you've done your best under difficult circumstances. That's why I'm prepared to offer you an alternative to formal proceedings." Emma's mouth went dry. "What kind of alternative?" The judge reached into his coat and withdrew a thick envelope. "There's a family in Denver, well-established, prosperous. They've been looking for a bright young boy to help with their business interests. Thomas would receive excellent tutoring, proper clothing, nutritious meals. He'd want for nothing." Emma stared at the envelope as if it contained a coiled snake. "You want me to sell my brother?" "Miss Harper," the judge said, his tone sharpening slightly, "I want you to consider what's best for the boy. This family is prepared to offer substantial compensation for your cooperation. Enough to clear your debts and establish yourself comfortably elsewhere. You could start fresh, perhaps find a husband, build the life you deserve." The envelope landed on the table between them with a soft thud. Emma could see the edges of bills through the paper, more money than she had ever seen in one place. Enough to solve every problem that kept her awake at night. Enough to buy a different kind of freedom. "And if I refuse?" The judge's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Then we proceed through official channels. A formal hearing where the territory's resources are brought to bear on determining what's best for the child. I think you'll find that in such proceedings, the outcome is rarely favorable to unsuitable guardians." Emma understood. "Accept the bribe," and Tommy disappeared quietly. Refuse it and he disappeared anyway, but she'd be left with nothing except the knowledge that she could have at least profited from her loss. I need time to think. Of course, Judge Garrett said, rising from his chair. These are weighty decisions. But don't take too long, Miss Harper. The hearing is scheduled for the day after tomorrow, and once official proceedings begin, this generous offer will no longer be available. After they left, Emma sat alone in her cabin, staring at the envelope on her table. Outside, she could hear Tommy talking to the chickens, his voice bright with the unconscious joy of childhood. In 2 days, that voice might be silenced forever, replaced by the bitter resignation of a child who had learned too early that love wasn't enough to protect what mattered. She thought of Daniel's words in the saloon, his promise to help, his claim that he could stop Judge Garrett. But what if he couldn't? What if his confidence was misplaced, his plan doomed to failure? If she refused the judge's offer and Daniel's intervention failed, Tommy would still be taken, but she'd have nothing to show for her defiance except empty principles and a broken heart. Emma picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of the money inside. It would be so easy. Sign the papers, take the gold, tell herself she was doing what was best for Tommy. He was young enough to adapt, smart enough to survive. Maybe the family in Denver really would treat him well. Maybe this was just another form of love, the kind that meant letting go. But even as she told herself these lies, Emma knew the truth. She had seen what happened to children who disappeared into Judge Garrett's system. She had watched families destroyed by his version of benevolence. The money in the envelope was blood money, payment for a soul she refused to sell. Emma stood and walked to the window, watching Tommy chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Her brother was laughing, his arms spread wide as he spun in circles, trying to catch the dancing lights. He looked so young, so innocent, so utterly trusting that his sister would protect him from the darkness gathering around their small world. When Tommy came inside, grass-stained and breathless with excitement, Emma helped him wash up and prepare for bed without mentioning the judge's visit. She read him his favorite story, kissed his forehead, and tucked him in just as she had every night for 2 years. But this time, she lingered by his bedside, memorizing the sight of him safe and peaceful in his own bed. Emma, Tommy's voice was drowsy but concerned. Those men who came to visit, they weren't really here to help us, were they? Emma smoothed his dark hair back from his forehead. What makes you say that? The way they looked at me. Like they were measuring me for something. Tommy's eyes opened, suddenly alert. Are they going to try to take me away? Emma's throat tightened. I won't let that happen. Promise? The word hung in the air between them, weighted with all the hope and trust a child could hold. Emma knew she was making a promise she might not be able to keep, betting everything on the word of a man the world called a monster. I promise, she said. Tommy smiled and closed his eyes, satisfied. Within minutes he was asleep, his breathing deep and even. Emma sat beside his bed for a long time, watching over him, trying to memorize every detail of his peaceful face. Tomorrow night, when the moon was dark, everything would change. She could only pray it would change for the better. The next day passed in a haze of normalcy that felt like an elaborate charade. Emma taught her classes with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere. The children seemed to sense her distraction, stealing glances at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Even Tommy was quieter than usual, picking at his lunch and staring out the window as if watching for threats. As evening approached, Emma's nerves stretched tighter with each passing hour. Daniel had told her to be ready when the moon was dark, but he hadn't told her what to expect or what she should do. She prepared a small bag with essential items, trying to guess what they might need if they had to leave quickly. Money, clean clothes for Tommy, their mother's jewelry, their father's pocket watch. The tangible remnants of a life they might have to abandon. Just after sunset, a commotion in the street drew her attention. Emma peered through her curtains and saw Judge Garrett's men moving through town, talking to shopkeepers and residents. They were asking questions, she realized, gathering information about Daniel's movements and associates. The net was tightening. At full dark, with no moon to light the sky, Emma heard the soft whinny of a horse outside her cabin. She had been watching for Daniel all evening, but somehow he had approached without her seeing him. When she opened the door, he materialized from the shadows like a spirit made flesh. "It's time," he said simply. Emma nodded, her mouth too dry for words. She woke Tommy gently, helping him dress in warm clothes without fully explaining why. To his credit, the boy asked no questions, seeming to understand that this was not the time for childish curiosity. Daniel led them away from the cabin on foot, moving through the darkness with the sure steps of someone who knew every stone and shadow. Emma carried their small bag while Tommy clutched her free hand, his trust in her decision both humbling and terrifying. They reached Daniel's horse, a magnificent black gelding that stood quietly in a grove of aspens. The animal was even more impressive up close, clearly bred for speed and endurance. Daniel helped Tommy mount first, then offered his hand to Emma. "Where are we going?" she whispered. "Somewhere safe," Daniel replied. "Somewhere Judge Garrett's reach doesn't extend." As they rode through the night, Emma found herself pressed against Daniel's back, feeling the solid strength of him, the careful way he guided the horse through terrain that would have been treacherous in daylight. Tommy dozed fitfully in front of her, exhausted by the day's stress and the late hour. They climbed steadily into the mountains, following trails that seemed barely wide enough for a man on foot, let alone a horse carrying 3 riders. But Daniel's mount navigated the treacherous path with sure-footed grace, never missing a step despite the darkness. After what felt like hours, they reached a plateau hidden among the high peaks. There, nestled against a sheer cliff face, was a cabin Emma hadn't known existed. It was small but well built, with smoke rising from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. "Welcome to my home," Daniel said as he helped them dismount. The cabin's interior was sparse but comfortable, furnished with handmade furniture and lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the log walls. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, filling the room with warmth and the scent of burning pine. It was a refuge, Emma realized, a place where a man could disappear from the world and its troubles. Tommy explored the cabin with the irrepressible curiosity of childhood, examining everything from the books on the shelves to the rifle mounted above the mantel. Emma stood uncertainly in the center of the room, suddenly aware that she was alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew, having trusted him with the most precious thing in her world. "He'll be safe here," Daniel said, reading her thoughts. "There are supplies enough for weeks, and paths that lead deeper into the mountains if you need to run. Judge Garrett's men won't find this place." Emma turned to face him, seeing him clearly for the first time in the lamplight. Away from the town and its fearful whispers, he looked different. Younger, less threatening, more like a man carrying a heavy burden than a predator stalking prey. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "Now I go back to town and end this. Judge Garrett expects his hearing to proceed as planned. He's not going to get what he expects." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You're going to kill him." "Maybe," Daniel said simply. "Depends on how reasonable he decides to be. And if you don't come back? If something goes wrong?" Daniel turned from the window, his brown eyes serious in the firelight. "Then you take Tommy and you run. There's a trail that leads north from here, toward the Montana border. Follow it for 3 days, and you'll reach a settlement called Harmony Creek. There's a woman there named Sarah Mitchell who'll help you start over." The casual way he discussed his possible death chilled Emma to the bone. "Daniel, you don't have to do this. We could just disappear, start fresh somewhere else. Running isn't living, Emma, and as long as men like Garrett are free to prey on families like yours, nowhere is really safe." Daniel moved closer, his expression intense. "Besides, I made a promise 5 years ago. It's time I kept it." Emma wanted to argue, to find some other solution that didn't require Daniel to risk his life for strangers. But she could see the resolve in his face, the weight of old debts and older pain. This wasn't just about her and Tommy. This was about justice. For his own family, for all the families that had been destroyed by Judge Garrett's greed. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk everything for us?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to where Tommy sat reading by the fire. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because 5 years ago, I failed to protect the people I loved. I let evil men take everything that mattered to me." He looked back at Emma, and she saw the depth of his pain, the weight of guilt he carried like a stone in his chest. "I can't bring my family back, but maybe I can save yours." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. This man, this supposed monster, was willing to sacrifice everything for strangers because he couldn't bear to see another family destroyed. The stories about Black Dan Sullivan were lies, she realized. The real Daniel was something far more dangerous than an outlaw. He was a man with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. "When will you go?" she asked. "Before dawn. Garrett likes to conduct his business early, before the town is fully awake. Fewer witnesses that way." Daniel moved to a chest near the bed and began removing items. Ammunition, a second revolver, a knife with a leather sheath. "Whatever happens, Emma, don't come looking for me. Promise me that. If I don't return by sunset tomorrow, you take Tommy and you run." Emma nodded, though the thought of fleeing into the wilderness terrified her almost as much as losing her brother. "I promise." Daniel holstered his weapons and pulled on a heavy coat. At the door, he paused, looking back at Emma and Tommy. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the scars and lines that spoke of a hard life lived on the edges of civilization. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Something you should know, in case I don't get the chance to tell you later." Emma waited, her heart hammering in her chest. "Every night for the past 2 weeks, I've been watching over you and Tommy from the ridge above your cabin. And every night, I've prayed for your safety, for your happiness, for a future free from the kind of pain I've known." Daniel's voice grew softer still. "I know it doesn't make sense. A man like me praying for people like you. But you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Daniel smiled, and for a moment, Emma caught a glimpse of the man he might have been in a different world, under different circumstances. "Hope," he said simply. Then he was gone, disappearing into the mountain darkness like a ghost returning to haunt the world of the living. Emma stood at the window long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, staring out at the star-filled sky and wondering if she would ever see him again. Beside the fire, Tommy had fallen asleep in his chair, the book still open in his lap. Emma covered him with a blanket and settled into the other chair to wait for dawn. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, carrying with it the prayers of a man the world called soulless, riding toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone he had learned to love. Dawn broke cold and gray over Cedar Falls. As Daniel Sullivan rode down the main street like judgment itself, the town seemed to hold its breath as his black horse's hooves struck the packed earth with rhythmic precision. Windows remained shuttered, doors stayed barred, and even the dogs seemed to sense that this morning carried the weight of reckoning. Judge Garrett was already at his temporary courthouse, a converted room above the general store that served as his seat of territorial authority. Daniel could see the warm glow of lamplight through the windows, could hear the murmur of voices as the judge prepared for what he believed would be a routine hearing. The man's confidence would be his downfall. Daniel dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post with deliberate care. His movements were calm, measured, betraying none of the fury that burned like forged fire in his chest. 5 years he had hunted the men who destroyed his family. 5 years of following cold trails and colder leads. Now finally, justice would have its day. The stairs creaked under his boots as he climbed toward the makeshift courtroom. Through the thin walls, he could hear Judge Garrett's voice, smooth as honey, discussing the morning's proceedings with his clerk. The man sounded relaxed, pleased with himself, anticipating another easy victory over the powerless and desperate. Daniel paused at the door, his hand resting on the brass handle. Once he opened this door, there would be no turning back. The careful balance of his double life would crumble, and Black Dan Sullivan would finally face the consequences of his choices. But Emma and Tommy would be safe, and that was worth any price. He opened the door and stepped inside. Judge Garrett looked up from his papers, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp alarm in the space of a heartbeat. The clerk, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers, actually squeaked and dropped his pen. The judge's 2 bodyguards reached for their weapons, but froze when they saw Daniel's hands resting casually on his gun belts. "Gentlemen," Daniel said pleasantly, as if he were entering a church social rather than interrupting a conspiracy. "I hope I'm not disturbing anything important." Judge Garrett recovered his composure with impressive speed, though Daniel noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he set down his papers. "Mr. Sullivan, this is unexpected. I wasn't aware. You had business with this court." "Oh, but I do," Daniel replied, moving further into the room with predatory grace. "You see, Your Honor, you've been conducting business that concerns me. Taking children from their families, selling them to the highest bidder. That's the kind of behavior that attracts my attention." The judge's face remained carefully neutral, but Daniel caught the flicker of calculation in his eyes. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. I'm simply a territorial judge conducting lawful hearings in the best interests of orphan children." "Is that what you call it?" Daniel's voice remained conversational, but there was steel beneath the silk. "Tell me, Judge, what happened to little Mary Patterson? The one whose mother died of fever 6 months ago? Where exactly did you place her in your infinite wisdom?" A muscle twitched in Garrett's jaw. "That information is confidential, part of sealed court proceedings." "Confidential," Daniel repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. How convenient. Just like the sealed proceedings for the Morrison children, and the Walsh boy, and all the others who disappeared into your version of charity. The 2 bodyguards were growing restless, their hands hovering near their weapons. Daniel could see the sweat beading on their foreheads despite the morning chill. They knew his reputation, knew that men who drew on Black Dan Sullivan rarely lived to regret it. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Garrett said carefully, "I think there's been some misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this privately, away from my staff." Daniel smiled, and there was nothing pleasant about the expression. "Oh, I think your staff should hear this. After all, they're accessories to everything you've done. They've helped you destroy families, steal children, line your pockets with blood money. They deserve to know what they're really working for." The clerk made a small strangled sound and began edging toward the door. Daniel's gaze flicked to him briefly, and the man froze like a rabbit caught in the open. "You see, gentlemen," Daniel continued, his attention returning to the judge, "I've been tracking your operation for quite some time. Denver, Colorado Springs, Pueblo. Always the same pattern, always the same result. Children vanish, records disappear, and Judge William Garrett moves on to the next territory, the next set of victims." Garrett's mask of benevolent authority was beginning to slip, revealing glimpses of the predator beneath. "You're making very serious accusations, Mr. Sullivan. Accusations that could be considered threats against a territorial official." "Threats?" Daniel laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Judge, I don't make threats. I make promises. And I promised myself 5 years ago that I would find every man responsible for what happened to my family. You're the last name on my list." For the first time, genuine fear flickered in Judge Garrett's eyes. Your family? Samuel and Rebecca Morrison, my wife and daughter. They were traveling through Pueblo when your associates decided they looked prosperous enough to rob. When they fought back, your men killed them both. Daniel's voice never changed, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. My 8-year-old daughter died begging for her life while your partner Lucas Morrison put a bullet in her mother's heart. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the bodyguard seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. Judge Garrett stared at Daniel as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Morrison, the judge whispered. You're not Sullivan at all. Daniel Morrison, he confirmed. I took the name Sullivan after my family died. Seemed fitting, since it means dark-eyed one. Appropriate for a man who's seen too much darkness. His hands moved slightly, and suddenly his revolvers were in his hands, though no one had seen him draw, but the darkness ends today. Judge Garrett lurched to his feet, his chair toppling backward. Now see here, Morrison. Whatever happened to your family, I had nothing to do with it. You can't hold me responsible for the actions of others, can't I? Daniel's voice was soft as silk and twice as deadly. You recruited Lucas Morrison. You provided him with information about potential targets. You gave him official documents that made his crimes look legal. And when he killed my family, you helped him disappear. The judge's face had gone pale as parchment. That's not how it happened, no? Daniel tilted his head slightly, like a cat studying a wounded mouse. Then why don't you tell me how it did happen? I've got time. One of the bodyguards, a man with the look of a hired killer about him, decided he'd heard enough. His hand flashed toward his gun, but Daniel was faster. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the confined space, and the man crumpled to the floor, clutching his shattered wrist. Anyone else feeling restless? Daniel asked pleasantly, smoke still curling from the barrel of his Colt. The remaining bodyguard and the clerk both raised their hands, their faces white with terror. Judge Garrett stood frozen behind his desk, staring at the wounded man on the floor. Good, Daniel said. Now where were we? Oh yes, you were about to explain how my wife and daughter died. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, Garrett babbled, his carefully constructed dignity crumbling like sand. Lucas was only supposed to take their money, their valuables. He wasn't supposed to kill anyone. But he did kill them, Daniel said quietly, and you covered it up. Made it look like a random robbery gone wrong. Helped him change his name and disappear. I didn't have a choice. He threatened to expose the whole operation if I didn't help him. There's always a choice, Judge. You chose money over justice. You chose corruption over conscience. And now you're choosing to compound your crimes by targeting more innocent families. Daniel moved closer to the desk, his revolvers trained on the judge's chest. The Harper boy. Where were you planning to send him? Garrett's breath came in shallow gasps. There's a man in Kansas City. He pays well for strong boys, smart ones who can be trained. Trained for what? The judge's silence spoke volumes. Daniel felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him across half the continent in pursuit of justice. The same fate you had planned for all those other children, Daniel said. Slavery dressed up as charity. Child labor camps disguised as educational institutions. How many families have you destroyed, Garrett? How many children have you sold? I can't count them. Daniel's voice cracked like a whip. Every child, every family. I want numbers. Dozens, Garrett whispered. Maybe 100 children over the years. The words hit Daniel like physical blows. 100 children. 100 families destroyed by this man's greed. His own Rebecca had been just one among many, her bright smile and musical laugh extinguished to line a corrupt judge's pockets. Where's Lucas Morrison now? Dead, Garrett said quickly. Shot in a card game in Dodge City 2 years ago. I swear it's true. Daniel studied the man's face, reading the fear and desperation there. It was true. Lucas Morrison was beyond earthly justice, but Judge Garrett was very much alive and very much guilty. That's unfortunate, Daniel said finally. I was looking forward to having words with him. Morrison, please. I know I've done wrong, but killing me won't bring your family back. It won't help those children. No, Daniel agreed. But it will stop you from destroying any more families. And sometimes, that's the best justice we can manage. The judge fell to his knees, his hands clasped in supplication. Please, I have money, connections. I can make reparations, help you find the children who were taken. I can be useful to you. Daniel looked down at the groveling man and felt something cold settle in his chest. This was what 5 years of hunting had led to. Not the monster he had imagined, but a pathetic creature driven by greed and weakness. Killing him would be easy, satisfying in a primitive way. But it wouldn't heal the wounds in Daniel's soul or bring back the children who had already suffered. You're right about one thing, Daniel said quietly. Killing you won't bring them back. But it will send a message to anyone else thinking of following in your footsteps. He raised his revolver, and Judge Garrett closed his eyes, waiting for the bullet that would end his corrupt life. But the shot never came. Instead, Daniel holstered his weapon and stepped back. Get up. Garrett opened his eyes, confusion replacing terror. What? I said get up. You're going to write some letters. With shaking hands, Judge Garrett pulled himself to his feet. Letters? To every territorial authority from here to Kansas City. You're going to confess everything. Every child you've taken, every family you've destroyed, every official you've bribed. You're going to provide locations, names, documentation, everything. And if I refuse? Daniel's smile was sharp as a blade. Then I'll forget about being merciful. The next hour passed in tense silence as Judge Garrett wrote letter after letter, his hand cramped and shaking from the effort. Daniel stood over him, occasionally correcting details or demanding additional information. The wounded bodyguard was helped outside by his companion, both men eager to escape the room's oppressive atmosphere. When the last letter was signed and sealed, Daniel gathered the documents and tucked them into his coat. There's one more thing, he said. Judge Garrett looked up with eyes red from strain and fear. What? Tommy Harper's custody papers. All of them. I want every document relating to his case destroyed. They're in the strongbox. But the transfer order has already been filed with the territorial office. Then you'll send another letter explaining that new evidence has come to light proving the boy's guardian is perfectly capable of caring for him. Daniel's voice brooked no argument. You'll recommend that all proceedings be dismissed and that the family be left in peace. Garrett nodded frantically, already reaching for his pen. Of course, whatever you want. As the judge wrote the final letter, Daniel found himself thinking of Emma and Tommy, safe in his mountain cabin. They would be able to return to their normal lives now, free from the shadow of corruption and greed. Tommy would grow up with his sister, would learn to be a good man from her example. It was more than Daniel had been able to give his own daughter, but it would have to be enough. It's finished, Garrett said, setting down his pen. Daniel reviewed the letter, then nodded his satisfaction. You have 24 hours to get out of Cedar Falls. If I see you in this territory again, I'll finish what I started here today. Where am I supposed to go? I don't care. Find a hole somewhere and crawl into it. But stay away from children, and stay away from families who can't protect themselves. Judge Garrett nodded frantically, already gathering his personal effects. Yes, of course. You won't see me again, I promise. Daniel paused at the door, looking back at the broken man who had caused so much pain. Judge, he said quietly, if I ever hear of you harming another child, another family, I'll hunt you down no matter where you hide. And next time I won't be so generous. The judge's face was gray with terror as Daniel left the makeshift courtroom. Outside, the sun was climbing higher in the sky, burning away the morning mist and revealing Cedar Falls in all its ordinary beauty. People were emerging from their hiding places, drawn by curiosity and the news that would spread like wildfire through the small community. Daniel mounted his horse and rode slowly through town, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed. At the post office, he handed over Judge Garrett's confession letters, along with enough money to ensure they reached their destinations quickly. The postmaster, an elderly man with kind eyes, accepted the package without question. Important. Business? The man asked. You could say that, Daniel replied. Make sure those get where they're going. As Daniel rode toward the mountains, he could already see the signs of Judge Garrett's hasty departure. A wagon loaded with belongings, men moving with the urgent efficiency of people eager to be elsewhere. By evening, the corrupt judge would be nothing but an unpleasant memory. The ride to the mountain cabin took most of the day, but Daniel didn't mind. For the first time in 5 years, he felt something approaching peace. The weight of vengeance that had driven him across half the continent was finally lifting from his shoulders. Justice had been served, not in the way he had originally planned, but in a way that would help heal the wounds rather than simply adding to them. As he crested the final ridge before his hidden retreat, Daniel saw smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. Emma and Tommy were safe, waiting for news of their fate. The boy would never know how close he had come to disappearing into the machinery of territorial corruption. That was a burden Daniel would carry alone. The cabin door opened as he dismounted, and Emma stepped out into the afternoon sunlight. Her face was tense with worry, but when she saw him whole and unhurt, relief flooded her features like sunrise. After a long night, "It's over," Daniel said simply. Emma's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Tommy?" "Safe. The custody proceedings have been dismissed. Judge Garrett has left the territory and won't be returning." Tommy burst from the cabin. Like a cork from a bottle, his young face bright with excitement. "Daniel, did you really face down Judge Garrett? Did you have a gunfight?" Daniel dismounted and ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. "Nothing so dramatic. Sometimes the pen really is mightier than the sword." As they sat around the cabin's table that evening, sharing a simple meal and telling stories, Daniel found himself studying Emma's face in the firelight. She looked younger somehow, as if a crushing weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Tommy chattered excitedly about their mountain adventure, already turning it into the kind of tale that would grow with each telling. "What happens now?" Emma asked quietly as Tommy dozed by the fire. "You go home," Daniel said. "You teach your students, raise your brother, live the life you were meant to live. And you?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I don't know. For 5 years, revenge was all I had. Now that it's done," he shrugged, "I suppose I'll have to figure out who Daniel Morrison is when he's not hunting down his family's killers." Emma reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You could find out here. In Cedar Falls, Tommy could use a male influence in his life, and the town could use a man willing to stand up to corruption." Daniel looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of human connection for the first time since his family's death. "Emma, you don't know what you're saying. I'm wanted in 3 territories. The things I've done, the things you did to protect innocent people," Emma interrupted. "The things you did to seek justice when the law failed. That's not the same as being a criminal. The law might disagree. Then maybe it's time for a new law, a better law." Emma's grip tightened on his hand. "Daniel, you saved my family. You saved countless other families by stopping Judge Garrett. You're a good man." "I've killed people, Emma. I've stolen, lied, broken more laws than I can count, to protect the innocent, to seek justice for your murdered family." Emma leaned forward, her eyes intense in the firelight. Every night for 2 weeks you knelt on that mountain ridge and prayed for our safety. Do you think a man without a soul would do that? Daniel felt something break open in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 5 long years. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've become. Then learn, Emma said simply. Learn with us. Stay in Cedar Falls. Help us rebuild what Judge Garrett tried to destroy. Be the man you were meant to be, instead of the man your pain made you. Tommy stirred by the fire, mumbling something in his sleep about horses and mountains. Daniel looked at the boy, so young and trusting, and felt a fierce protectiveness that reminded him of how he had once felt about his own daughter. It won't be easy, he said quietly. There will be those who remember Black Dan Sullivan, who won't trust Daniel Morrison. Then we'll prove them wrong, Emma said. One day at a time, one good deed at a time. We'll show them that people can change, that redemption is possible. Daniel lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. Are you sure? Once you choose this path, there's no going back. You'll be tied to a man with a violent past, a man who's made enemies across half the continent. Emma smiled, and Daniel felt his heart skip a beat. I'm already tied to you, Daniel Morrison. You saved my family, risked your life for strangers, chose mercy over vengeance when you had every right to kill. If that's not the kind of man I want in my life, then I don't know what is. As they prepared to return to Cedar Falls the next morning, Daniel found himself seeing the world through different eyes. The mountains were still beautiful, the sky still endless, but now they were more than just hiding places and escape routes. They were home. Tommy rode in front of Daniel on the big black horse, chattering excitedly about everything he could see from his elevated perch. Emma rode beside them on the gentle mare Daniel had acquired for their journey home, her face peaceful in the morning. Sunlight. Daniel, Tommy said suddenly. Are you going to marry Emma? Daniel nearly choked on his coffee. Tommy, what? The boy asked innocently. She likes you, and you like her. That's what people do when they like each other, isn't it? Emma's cheeks turned pink, but she was smiling. Tommy, that's not how these things work. Why not? Tommy persisted. Daniel's brave and good, and he prays for us every night. Mama always said the best men were the ones who talked to God regular like. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Your sister is a very special woman, Tommy. Any man would be lucky to have her. Then why don't you ask her? Tommy, Emma said firmly, though her blush had deepened. Some conversations are for adults to have in private. Oh, Tommy said, disappointed but accepting. Then he brightened. But you'll think about it, right? Daniel caught Emma's eye and saw his own hopes reflected there. I'll think about it, he promised. As they rode down into Cedar Falls, Daniel noticed the changes immediately. People came out of their homes and shops to watch them pass. But instead of fear and suspicion, he saw curiosity and something that might have been respect. Word of Judge Garrett's sudden departure had spread quickly, and while the full story might never be known, enough had leaked out to give the townspeople an idea of what had really happened. Sheriff Brooks met them at the edge of town, his expression unreadable. Daniel tensed, ready for confrontation, but the lawman simply tipped his hat. Morrison, he said quietly. Heard Judge Garrett won't be coming back. That's right, Daniel replied carefully. Good, Brooks said simply. Man like that, he was poison. Town's better off without him. He paused, studying Daniel's face. Question is, what about you? You planning to stick around, or you moving on? Daniel glanced at Emma, who gave him an encouraging nod. I'm thinking of staying, Sheriff. If the town will have me. Brooks was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Daniel to Emma to Tommy. Reckon that depends on who you plan to be. Black Dan Sullivan ain't welcome here. But Daniel Morrison, the man who stood up to corruption and protected a family in need, he shrugged. Town could use more men like that. As they rode toward Emma's cabin, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of a future that didn't revolve around violence and vengeance. He thought of his wife and daughter, of the prayers he had whispered into the mountain wind, of the choice between justice and mercy that had changed everything. That evening, as Tommy helped with chores and Emma prepared dinner, Daniel stood on the cabin's small porch and looked up at the ridge where he had kept his vigil. Tomorrow night, he would climb that trail again, but not as a guardian watching from afar. Tomorrow night, he would kneel among the pines and offer prayers of gratitude instead of desperate pleas for protection. The people of Cedar Falls had been wrong about Black Dan Sullivan. He wasn't a soulless outlaw without conscience or compassion. He was a man who had lost everything and found himself again in the simple act of protecting others. He was a man who talked to God in the language of the desperate and the grateful, who had learned that sometimes the greatest strength came from choosing mercy over vengeance. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel Morrison stood on the threshold of a new life. Behind him, warm light spilled from the cabin windows, carrying with it the sounds of family, of home, of hope reborn. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenges, the hard work of rebuilding a life from the ashes of the old. But for the first time in 5 years, Daniel Morrison was no longer afraid of tomorrow. He had found his soul again in the mountains of Colorado, in the trust of a woman and the laughter of a child, in the simple act of choosing love over hate. And that, he knew, was worth any price the future might demand. 2 years had passed since Judge Garrett fled Cedar Falls like a whipped dog, his tail between his legs and his corrupt empire crumbling behind him. The mountain town had settled back into its natural rhythm, the kind of peaceful existence that came when good people were left alone to live their lives without interference from those who would exploit their weaknesses. The schoolhouse bell rang across the valley as it had every morning for the past 24 months. But now there was something different about its sound. Where once it had carried undertones of desperation and fear, now it sang with hope and promise. Children ran toward the one-room building with eager faces, their laughter echoing off the surrounding peaks like music made manifest. Emma Harper Morrison stood at the school's threshold, watching her students file past with the satisfaction that came from work well done and lives well lived. Her wedding ring caught the morning sunlight, a simple band of gold that spoke of love found in the most unlikely circumstances. She had traded her worn teaching dress for something newer, brighter, though she still maintained the practical sensibilities that had seen her through the darkest days. Inside the schoolhouse, 23 children of various ages bent over their lessons with the kind of focus that came from knowing their education was valued, protected, fought for. Among them sat Tommy Harper Morrison, now 14 and growing into the kind of young man who would make any family proud. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he worked through a particularly challenging arithmetic problem, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. The boy had grown taller in the past 2 years, his shoulders broadening with the promise of the man he would become. But more than his physical changes, it was the light in his eyes that marked the difference between the frightened child, who had once faced an uncertain future, and the confident teenager who now helped younger students with their lessons. He had learned what it meant to be truly safe, to be unconditionally loved, to have adults in his life who would move mountains before they would let harm come to him. At the back of the classroom, working quietly on his own studies, sat another student who drew curious glances from visitors but was simply part of the fabric of daily life for those who knew him. Daniel Morrison, former outlaw turned respectable citizen, bent over a law book with the same intensity. He had once applied to tracking corrupt officials across 3 territories. His large hands, scarred from years of hard living, handled the delicate pages with surprising gentleness. Sheriff Brooks had suggested the course of study 6 months earlier, pointing out that Cedar Falls could use a man with Daniel's particular understanding of justice and law enforcement. The territorial authorities had been surprisingly amenable to the idea, especially after the confession letters from Judge Garrett had exposed the extent of corruption in their ranks. A man who had single-handedly dismantled a child trafficking operation was exactly the kind of person they wanted on their side. Daniel looked up from his reading and caught Emma's eye, sharing one of those wordless communications that had become second nature between them. She smiled and nodded toward the window, where the first snow of the season was beginning to dust the mountain peaks. Winter was coming early this year, but unlike the winters of the past, this one held no terrors for the Morrison family. The cabin that had once housed Emma and Tommy's desperate poverty now stood warm and welcoming, enlarged with an additional room and improvements that spoke of prosperity earned through honest work. Daniel's skills extended far beyond gunplay and tracking. He had proved himself an able carpenter, a skilled hunter, and a surprisingly gentle teacher of practical skills to the young men of Cedar Falls. But it was his role as deputy sheriff that had truly transformed both Daniel and the community around him. Sheriff Brooks, recognizing that his aging bones weren't suited to chasing criminals through mountain terrain, had been grateful to have a partner who understood the criminal mind from personal experience. Daniel's reputation preceded him when dealing with troublemakers, but it was his fairness and restraint that had earned him the respect of law-abiding citizens. 3 months earlier, a group of cattle rustlers had thought Cedar Falls would be easy pickings, isolated as it was in the mountain valley. They had reckoned without Deputy Morrison, who tracked them through terrain that would have defeated most pursuers and brought them back, alive despite having every justification to shoot them where they stood. The rustlers now worked off their debt to the community through hard labor, several of them having decided that honest work was preferable to constantly looking over their shoulders for Daniel Morrison. As the morning lessons continued, Emma found her thoughts drifting to the evening ritual that had become as natural as breathing. Every night after supper, after Tommy had finished his homework and the dishes were clean, Daniel would climb the trail to the ridge above their home. Emma had followed him once, early in their marriage, curious about this habit he could never quite explain. She had found him kneeling among the pines where he had kept his vigil during those desperate weeks 2 years ago, his voice raised in quiet conversation with the Almighty. But the prayers had changed. Where once they had been desperate pleas for protection, now they were expressions of gratitude, requests for wisdom, and acknowledgments of blessings received. Emma had never intruded on those private moments again, understanding instinctively that this was Daniel's way of maintaining his connection to something larger than himself. But sometimes, when the wind was just right, she could hear the murmur of his voice drifting down from the mountain, and the sound never failed to fill her with a peace that passed understanding. The morning passed quickly, as mornings in the schoolhouse always did. Children recited their lessons, worked through their sums, and listened with rapt attention as Emma read from the latest book to arrive via the territorial mail service. Daniel helped the older boys with their penmanship while studying his own legal texts, a sight that never failed to amuse Emma, the notorious Black Dan Sullivan. Learning to write proper legal briefs was a transformation that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. At noon, the children scattered for their lunch break, some heading home to eat with their families, others gathering around the schoolhouse stove to share packed meals and gossip. Tommy remained behind to help his sister tidy the classroom, a responsibility he had taken on willingly as the man of the family, though Daniel's presence had relieved him of much of that burden. "Emma," Tommy said as he erased the morning's lessons from the blackboard, "Mrs. Caldwell says there's been talk in town about making Daniel the sheriff when Mr. Brooks retires." Emma looked up from the papers she was grading, her attention caught by something in Tommy's tone. "What kind of talk?" "Good talk, mostly. People saying he's the kind of man who knows right from wrong, who won't be bought or scared off." Tommy paused in his erasing, but some folks are still nervous about his past, about what he used to be. Daniel, who had been absorbed in his law book, glanced up at the mention of his name. Something troubling you, son? Tommy turned to face his brother-in-law, and Emma was struck once again by how much the boy had grown to resemble their father. The same steady gaze, the same stubborn chin, the same innate sense of fairness that had made John Harper a respected man in the community. Not troubling, exactly, Tommy said carefully. But I've been thinking about what people say about you. About who you used to be and who you are now. Daniel set down his book and gave Tommy his full attention. This was the way he approached all conversations with the boy, as if Tommy's thoughts and opinions were every bit as important as those of any adult. It was one of the many things that had endeared him to Emma in those early days of their courtship. "And what have you concluded?" Daniel asked. Tommy was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts with the same deliberation he applied to his schoolwork. "I think people get too caught up in names and stories. They want to put folks in boxes, label them as good or bad, hero or villain. But that's not how people really work, is it?" Emma felt her heart swell with pride. At 14, Tommy was already showing the kind of wisdom that some adults never achieved. How do people really work? Daniel asked, genuinely curious about the boy's perspective. "They're complicated," Tommy said simply. "They make mistakes, they learn from them. They try to do better." The man who used to be called Black Dan Sullivan made some hard choices, but they were choices that protected innocent people. The man who's Daniel Morrison now makes different choices, but they come from the same place. From wanting to do what's right. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "You've given this a lot of consideration." "Had to," Tommy said with a slight grin. "Can't have people bad-mouthing my family without thinking through a proper response." The simple words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Family. After 2 years, he still sometimes found it hard to believe that he belonged to something larger than himself again, that he had people who would defend him simply because they loved him. Emma watched the interplay between her husband and brother with the warm satisfaction that came from seeing the people she loved most finding their way to understanding. Daniel had worried, in those early days, about his ability to be a positive influence on Tommy. The boy had lost his father at such a young age, and Daniel feared that his own violent past would somehow taint the kind of man Tommy would become. Instead, the opposite had happened. Tommy's innate goodness and clear moral compass had helped Daniel find his way back to the man he had been before tragedy transformed him into something harder and more dangerous. The boy's questions, his observations, his simple acceptance of Daniel's family had done more to heal old wounds than years of solitude and self-recrimination ever could have. "You know," Daniel said, returning to his book but speaking casually, "if Sheriff Brooks does decide to retire, and if the town council does ask me to take his place, I'll need a deputy. Someone I can trust, someone who understands the difference between justice and vengeance." Tommy's eyes widened. "You mean me? In a few years when you're old enough. You've got the temperament for it, the moral clarity. And you understand this community in ways that an outsider never could." Emma watched her brother's face light up with excitement and pride, and she felt a familiar surge of gratitude for the man who had entered their lives like an answered prayer. Daniel had a gift for seeing potential in people, for believing in them even when they couldn't believe in themselves. The afternoon lessons passed in a blur of geography and history, with Daniel occasionally contributing details about the various territories he had traveled through during his outlaw years. The children hung on every word, fascinated by stories of distant places and different ways of life. Emma noticed that Daniel had a natural teaching ability, a way of making even the driest subjects come alive through personal anecdotes and real-world connections. As the school day ended and the children scattered to their homes, Emma began her usual routine of cleaning the classroom and preparing for the next day's lessons. Daniel helped without being asked, sweeping floors and straightening desks with the same methodical care he applied to everything in his life. "Mrs. Morrison," called a voice from the doorway. Emma looked up to see Sarah Patterson, the wife of one of the local miners, standing hesitantly at the threshold. In her arms was a baby, barely 6 months old, and beside her stood a girl of perhaps 10 years with the wide eyes and hollow cheeks that spoke of recent hardship. "Sarah," Emma said warmly, setting down her papers. "Please come in." "How can I help you?" Sarah stepped into the classroom, her gaze moving nervously between Emma and Daniel. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I heard. That is, people said you might be able to help with a situation." Daniel straightened from his sweeping, his expression immediately alert. In the past 2 years, he had developed a reputation as someone who could solve problems that fell outside the normal scope of law enforcement. Families in trouble, children in danger, situations that required a combination of official authority and unofficial methods. "What kind of situation?" Emma asked gently. Sarah's grip tightened on her baby, and the older girl moved closer to her mother's side. "It's my husband's brother, Marcus. He came to town last week, said he was looking for work. But Tom thinks, we think he might be running from something or someone." Daniel set aside his broom and moved closer, his demeanor shifting into the alert watchfulness that Emma recognized from his more dangerous days. "What makes you think that?" "He's jumpy, always looking over his shoulder. And yesterday, some men came through town asking questions about him. Hard-looking men, the kind that make honest folks nervous." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Tom's worried they might be the kind of men who settle disputes with guns rather than words." Emma exchanged a glance with Daniel, reading the concern in his eyes. Cedar Falls had enjoyed 2 years of peace and prosperity, but they both knew that safety was never guaranteed. The world beyond their mountain valley was still full of dangerous people and violent solutions to complex problems. "Where is Marcus now?" Daniel asked. "Staying with us, but Tom's afraid to have him around the children. Not because Marcus would hurt them, but because of what might happen if those men come looking for him." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his mind working through the implications and possibilities. Emma could almost see him weighing options, calculating risks, preparing for the kind of situation he had hoped was behind him forever. "Sarah," he said finally, "I want you to take the children home and stay inside tonight. Lock your doors. Keep the curtains drawn. If anyone comes asking questions, you don't know anything about Marcus. What about my husband? He's working the late shift at the mine. I'll talk to Sheriff Brooks, make sure Tom has an escort home." Daniel's expression grew more serious. "And Sarah, if you hear gunshots tonight, you keep those children on the floor and away from the windows until someone you trust tells you it's safe." After Sarah left with her children, Emma felt the familiar chill of foreboding that had once been a constant companion. She had hoped those days were behind them, that Daniel's transformation from outlaw to lawman meant their family would never again face the kind of violence that had shaped so much of his past. "It might be nothing," Daniel said, reading her expression. "Could just be creditors or old gambling debts. Not everything has to end in blood." Emma nodded, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand unconsciously checked the position of his revolver. 2 years of peace had not erased the instincts that had kept him alive during his outlaw years. That evening, after a tense dinner during which Daniel explained the situation to Tommy and extracted promises that the boy would stay close to home, Emma found herself standing at the kitchen window, watching the trail that led up to Daniel's prayer ridge. He had left an hour earlier, as was his custom, but tonight felt different. Tonight, his prayers would carry the weight of new fears and old responsibilities. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, ostensibly working on his homework, but clearly distracted by the adult's tension. At 14, he was old enough to understand that danger was returning to their peaceful valley, but young enough to feel helpless in the face of forces beyond his control. "Emma," he said quietly, "is Daniel going to have to be Black Dan Sullivan again?" The question cut straight to the heart of Emma's own fears. She had fallen in love with Daniel Morrison, the man who read law books and helped children with their lessons, and knelt among the pines to offer prayers of gratitude. The thought of him reverting to the cold, dangerous persona that had once struck fear into the hearts of criminals across 3 territories filled her with a dread she could barely articulate. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I hope not. But if he has to? If protecting innocent people means becoming that man again?" Emma turned from the window to look at her brother, seeing in his young face the same moral complexity that had drawn her to Daniel in the first place. Tommy understood, perhaps better than she did, that sometimes good men had to do terrible things to protect what mattered most. "Then we'll love him through it," she said simply. "Just like he loved us through our darkest times." The sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin made them both freeze. Emma's hand went instinctively to the rifle above the fireplace, while Tommy moved to blow out the lamps. But then Daniel's voice called out from the darkness, identifying himself, and they both relaxed. Daniel entered the cabin with Sheriff Brooks close behind, both men wearing the grim expressions of lawmen preparing for trouble. Behind them came a third man Emma didn't recognize, thin and nervous with the haunted look of someone running from a past that had finally caught up with him. "This is Marcus Patterson," Daniel said without preamble. "And he's got a story to tell." Over the next hour, as Emma served coffee and Tommy listened with wide eyes, Marcus Patterson laid out a tale that was both familiar and heartbreaking. He had witnessed a murder in Kansas City, seen a prominent businessman kill a rival in what was supposed to be a private meeting. When Marcus had tried to go to the authorities, he discovered that the businessman owned half the police force and most of the judges. So Marcus had run, hoping to disappear into the vastness of the Western Territories. But powerful men have long reaches, and the killers they hired were persistent. The men asking questions in Cedar Falls were professionals, the kind who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who got in their way. "They'll be back tomorrow," Marcus said, his hands shaking as he held his coffee cup. "And when they find me, they'll kill me. Probably kill anyone who's helped me too." Sheriff Brooks leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. "Could send word to the territorial authorities, ask for help. By the time help arrives, it'll be over," Daniel said quietly. "These men won't wait for legal proceedings. They'll finish their business and be gone before anyone official can respond." Emma felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling over their home. They could turn Marcus over to his pursuers, saving themselves but condemning an innocent man to death. They could try to hide him, putting their entire community at risk. Or they could fight, which would mean Daniel reverting to the violent methods he had tried so hard to leave behind. "There is another option," Daniel said slowly, his gaze meeting Emma's across the room. "I could leave with Marcus. Draw them away from Cedar Falls. Deal with them somewhere that won't put innocent people at risk." "No," Emma said immediately. "Absolutely not. We're not going back to that. We're not splitting up this family." "Emma's right," Tommy said, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "We stick together. That's what families do." Daniel looked at the boy he had come to love as a son, seeing in Tommy's face the same stubborn determination that had attracted him to Emma in the first place. These people, this family, had given him something worth fighting for. But they had also given him something worth preserving, a peace and happiness he was reluctant to jeopardize. "Then we make our stand here," Sheriff Brooks said, settling the matter with the authority of his office. "I'll deputize some of the men, set up a watch. We've faced down threats before." As the evening wore on and plans were made, Emma found herself watching Daniel's face for signs of the transformation she dreaded. But instead of the cold calculation she remembered from their first meeting, she saw something different. He was planning for violence, yes, but not embracing it. He was preparing to protect his community, his family, his home, but without losing the essential gentleness that had made their love possible. Near midnight, as Sheriff Brooks and Marcus prepared to leave for the jail where the witness would spend the night under guard, Daniel made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I'm not going to the ridge tonight," he said quietly. "I'm staying here with my family." Emma felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. In all the months of their marriage, Daniel had never missed his nightly prayers. The fact that he was willing to break that pattern to stay close to them spoke volumes about his priorities. But Tommy, wise beyond his years, shook his head. "You should go," he said. "Maybe tonight more than any other night. Whatever's coming. Tomorrow we're going to need all the help we can get." Daniel studied the boy's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right. Some conversations can't be postponed." An hour later, Emma stood at the kitchen window again, watching the faint glow of Daniel's lantern disappear up the mountain trail. She could imagine him kneeling among the pines, his voice raised in the darkness, asking for strength and wisdom and the ability to protect innocent people without losing his soul in the process. When he returned, just before dawn, his face was peaceful in a way that convinced Emma their prayers had been heard. Whatever the day might bring, they would face it together as a family, with faith in each other and in the power of love to overcome even the darkest challenges. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and decisive. The hired killers arrived with the morning stage, 3 hard men with cold eyes and expensive guns. They found Deputy Morrison waiting for them in the middle of Main Street, wearing his badge and carrying the authority of territorial law. What they didn't expect was the unity of the community that had gathered behind him. Shop owners and miners, farmers and craftsmen, all armed and determined to protect one of their own. The sight of an entire town prepared to fight for a stranger's life was apparently more than the killers had bargained for. The standoff lasted less than 10 minutes. Faced with overwhelming opposition and a deputy who clearly knew how to handle himself in a fight, the hired guns decided that Marcus Patterson wasn't worth dying for. They rode out of Cedar Falls as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind a community that was stronger and more united than ever. Marcus Patterson stayed in Cedar Falls, finding work at the mine and gradually building a new life far from the violence that had pursued him. His story became part of the town's growing legend, another example of what happened when good people stood together against corruption and fear. But for Emma, the most important outcome was the realization that Daniel had faced his greatest test and emerged unchanged. He had been prepared to fight, to kill if necessary, but he had done so as Deputy Morrison, not as Black Dan Sullivan. The transformation was complete and permanent, sealed by the love of a family and the support of a community that had learned to see past reputation to the man beneath. That night, as they sat around their table sharing a quiet dinner, Tommy asked the question that had been on all their minds. "So what happens now?" Daniel looked across the table at his wife and brother-in-law, these people who had given him a second chance at life and love. "Now we keep living," he said simply. "We keep protecting what matters. We keep being a family." Later, as Emma watched Daniel climb the familiar trail to his prayer ridge, she felt a peace settle over her that was deeper than anything she had experienced in those early, desperate days. Their love had been tested by violence and emerged stronger. Their family had faced external threats and proven unbreakable. And high above their valley home, a man who had once been lost to darkness knelt among the pines and offered prayers of gratitude for blessings received, for dangers overcome, and for the simple miracle of being allowed to love and be loved in return. The sound of his voice drifted down on the mountain wind, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of a family that had found its way home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.